make a start, okay? So, as I said, welcome back to Future Tuesdays. We're absolutely delighted today to be joined by BAFTA winning game designer Brenda Romero, who is the co-owner of Romero Games. Brenda is many things, including a Fulbright scholar, an artist, an entrepreneur. As a designer, she's contributed to many seminal titles, including the Wizardry and Jagged Alliance series titles in the Ghost, Recon, and Dungeons and Dragons franchises. Her analog series of 6 games, The Mechanic is the Message, has drawn national and international acclaim, particularly for Train and Síochán Leat, which I hope I've said properly. And these are presently housed at the National Museum of Play. Brenda has won multiple awards and was listed among the 25 people who have changed games in 2013. Brenda also makes a significant contribution to the Advanced HE Aurora program, where I've heard Brenda speak and met with Brenda before. And I just wanted to say that as a participant, I listened very intently when Brenda said, don't be afraid to find something that you will love doing. And that is part of the story of how I came to work at Future Screens. Today, Brenda will be speaking on the topic of the hidden history of women in tech. So I'm just going to hand over now to Brenda. Thanks again for joining us, Brenda.
Let's see, first unmute myself. That's the important thing. And then I will get, oh, no, I won't. Hold on. Got to make sure I do these in the right order. Share screen. That's the screen to share. Okay. And now let's see. Hopefully you are looking at the first slide in the presentation, and then and from there I can go forward. So I should say, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's always I always appreciate an opportunity, and it's always an honor to be asked to speak, especially because as one of these days I look forward to changing the title of this just to histories, well-known, boring histories that everybody's heard 3,000 times. But right now that's not the case. I also want to say that just when people were coming in, I was clicking through the pages to see who was here, and I appreciate that the people, it's always nice when a very diverse group of people shows up to hear a talk that is fundamentally about diversity. If you've ever given a talk about women in tech, or in my case, often women in games, I find I'm sometimes just preaching to the choir. So I appreciate everybody who showed up today. And I want to say, if you've been to a talk about women in tech and women in diversity and you've left feeling depressed, hopefully that will not be how you leave feeling today, because this is actually a pretty cool talk, and there's a lot of cool things in this, and even more that I'm continuing to unearth. So with that, I will shut up on the beginning part and move into the actual talk itself. Okay, what is happening here? Okay, good. Sorry, for a minute there, I wasn't moving into the actual talk. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you 5 different stories. And for me, these were stories of discovery and something that fundamentally changed how I view the role of women in tech and in the broader tech industry. And you don't need to know how to code to tell these stories. It just happens to be the way I liked presenting it. So the first one is about usual suspects. And when we're talking about women in technology, people often roll out what I refer to as the usual suspects. And you've probably heard a lot of these names. So Ada Lovelace invents the very idea of programming in 1843. And an absolute rock star, Grace Hopper, invents COBOL. And she also invents the compiler. So her team at Remington Rand wrote the compiler for the A0 programming language. And they actually coined the term compiler to describe it. She also found the first computer bug, literally, and this is the bug that they found. If you wonder where that term comes from, that is the dead bug where it comes from. There's also Hedy Lamarr. So Hedy Lamarr invents Wi-Fi. This is the same Hedy Lamarr who was a well-known actress. And I want to say that every one of these women, without a doubt, is worthy of celebration, and their contributions to code and to technology cannot be understated. But I often find in articles about tech that are attempting to be inclusive, which is great, it's the same 1, 2, or 3 people that are mentioned as if that's all there were. Whereas if we think about men in tech, key male figures in technology, we could fill this page and 20 more pages, I'm sure. And before I jump into my next story, I want to say that usual suspects are important, even critically important, because they form the stereotypes of what we see in our heads and what people think of when they think what a person is. So for instance, if you say, think of a pilot, who popped into your head? Who was that? And these same things happen with kids, and they determine the course of their careers. So what's a surgeon, or what is a teacher? What's a nurse? What is a CEO? What's a lead programmer? And I saw this happen in my own home when I wanted to take my daughter to Coder Dojo, and they had this great event called Coolest Projects in the RTS Center in Dublin, and it's massive. And she said, I don't want to go because it's just all going to be boys. Now, mind you, this is my kid who, is certainly no stranger to tech or women in tech, but she really saw that this is what she was going to go into, and she had no desire to walk into that. And the reality was, it was way more diverse than that. There were many, many girls there. In fact, I felt like it was overwhelmingly girls when I went. So these usual suspects are important. They're what most people know, and people make career decisions based on these things. So now I'm going to talk about my impetus for even starting to investigate these things. So this is me. In this picture, I am 4 or 5 years old, and I get my start in tech, believe it or not, around that age. It's when I start making games. So my family, I guess you can probably tell, I grew up in the US, and my family had little money. So what we used to do, my mother would take us to garage sales or yard sales or tag sales, however you want to phrase it. And with that money, my mom would give me a dime, and with that dime, I could buy whatever I wanted. To me, it seemed like a load of money, but the reality was I couldn't really buy much, but I could get board games that were missing some of their pieces. So they weren't good for anything, I guess, except to get rid of. So what I would do is I would collect these board games, and I would take the pieces and parts, and I would make my own games out of them. And I remember that when I was around 10 years old, I actually got a brand new Monopoly board, a Monopoly game for my birthday. And I remember being so excited because it wasn't just the game on the front, but I could flip the board over and make my own game on the back. And that's how I started my career. So when I am 12, my mother gets me, for reasons I'll never understand, she gets me Dungeons and Dragons. My mother was a pretty religious woman. I don't think there's nothing terrifying in the box, but I think if she had known more about it, she wouldn't have got this for me. And it is impossible to overstate the effect that D&D had on me. For me, I could create worlds. I could go anywhere I wanted to go. I could ride dragons. I could be a wizard. And I feel like that's why when I saw Stranger Things, I was so blown away, because I was that awkward, unpopular, geeky kid. And all the kids in Stranger Things felt like me. And they were all going on adventures that I wanted to go on. And when I was 14, I upgraded to Rollmaster, which was its own gaming system. And I decided I didn't like the rules for encumbrance, which was if you're carrying a bunch of stuff, it slows you down, or you don't fight as well in combat. So I rewrote it. And if there's any programmers listening, you know that when you rewrite something, what ends up happening is you break other things down the chain. And sure enough, I broke most of it and ended up rewriting the entire thing. So it was my first, we'll say, go at being a game designer. And then in 1981, I got my job in the game industry. And this doesn't actually, well, sometimes it feels like the game industry, but in 1981, I was still in high school, and I grew up in northern New York, which is under snow most of the year. I also happened to smoke, which I would not advise for any reason, least of all getting into any kind of tech job. But I was standing in this bathroom smoking a cigarette to not get buried by the snow outside. And another woman came up to me and she said, just to be polite, she borrowed a cigarette off me. And then to be polite, she asked if I had a job. And I said, no. And she asked, had I ever heard of Surtech, which I hadn't heard of. And had I ever heard of Wizardry? Also no. But had I heard of Dungeons and Dragons? And as we now know, I absolutely had. And that is my sum total interview of how I got my job in the game industry. Quite clearly would not work today. So this is the first game I worked on at Wizardry 1, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. What you're looking at here, I know looks ridiculously rudimentary, but it was state of the art in 1981. And in fact, the Wizardry series is what leads to the Final Fantasy series, if you're familiar with that. So it ended up having some good legs on it. And my mother was ridiculously proud of me at the time. You know, when I got my job at Surtech, it gave me access to, among other things, I refer to this as my first husband, the Apple II. And I was in love with the Apple II. To me, 1981 was an explosion of technology. And I couldn't get enough of computers. Now, I also didn't have any money. You know, we were not well off. We didn't even know what well off was. We were quite a ways away from that. But it gave me access to tech that I would not have otherwise had. And I fell deeply in love with coding. If I had to do it 2 times, I would code it. And for me, coding was more creative than D&D. It was more creative than Legos. It more creative than game pieces. It let me build anything I wanted to build. So in high school, I begged the BAFTA teacher, as it turned out, to offer a programming class, which he did. It was in BASIC. And then we went on to learn Pascal from there. And then I got a gig in the game industry. And so funny enough, the after school coding classes, I left because then I was working more and more at Surtech. So during those years, we released a lot of games. These are just a few of them. And I was fortunate enough to put myself through college while still working in games and in technology. And during that time, I never saw myself as a woman in a man's world. In fact, my world at the time was mostly women. So if you look at this picture here of Surtech, you can see that there are 10 people. I joined just after it, and there are 5 men. And when I get there, now there are 5 women. So to me, it didn't seem odd. Now, if we fast forward 30 years, I'm still making games, which I still am today, and I'm also teaching at a university. And so I get tasked with the university's diversity initiative. And it was the department's diversity initiative. And so the initiative itself was the Athena Swan Initiative, which I still believe is that sounds odd, which I believe is a fantastic initiative that I wish they would expand to businesses. So Athena Swan just gives you basically a framework to look at everything that's happening within a university, within the university itself, to find out what types of roadblocks are we creating? What could we do to improve female retention into, say, computer science programs or whatever the program may be? And it's absolutely fantastic. And it's a real, it really illuminates the challenges that people can face going through things. So, everything from, no nursing rooms to, PhD, the years of the PhD also happening to be the prime childbearing years. So I was actually super excited about this. It's something I've always been interested in. And so I went off and I wrote this email to start it off. And the first response I got back within about an hour was this. Somebody said it was half-baked populist jargon. And then further added that women are not interested in tech, that there was nothing we could do, that other people had tried and failed similarly, that it's just not something women were interested in. So needless to say, I found this quite surprising. So I sent an email off to the head of department and I said, I just wanted to draw your attention to this because, this is shocking. It's shocking that somebody in a position of educating women, recruiting women, retaining women, supervising PhD students would say something like this. And the response I got back was, and I quote this word for word, that there is little point in taking offense. So if anything, I decided I wasn't taking enough offense. And that was the entire point. And so I set out to do some archaeological digging and prove them wrong. And this is the result of my archaeological dig. What you are looking at are the very first computers, not the machine behind them, but the people in front of them. Literally, that's what the job was called. Women were the first computers. And programming jobs were advertised to women specifically because they required, and many of the ads said these words, menial, detail-oriented labor. And at the time, people deemed women to be the perfect fit for this sort of thing. And in fact, IBM in the UK, up until the 1970s, measured code in girl hours. This was the actual term that they used. And I'm finding loads of evidence at one point in time in places here and there that women were definitely not the minority, and in some cases were the overwhelming majority. And it's because they deemed labor perfectly suited women, the menial, detail-oriented nature of it. Now, one thing to consider, if we look back to typewriters, men will say, build the machines. There was a lot of allure in being a hardware engineer. And women will type on the machines. Similarly, men will build the computers and women will type on the computers. It just so happens that computers understand not the alphabet so much, but assembly language. And so women were tasked with learning these early programming languages. There was an amazing study done in Dundee, Scotland, where the ZX Spectrum comes from. And when I talk to people about their first computers, just like the Apple II was my first husband, for many, the ZX Spectrum is just full of warm, fuzzy, great feelings. And this machine was built by women. But the women who believed that their labor was menial and detail-oriented were not even included in celebrations about this until a master's student working on this very project made sure that they were highlighted, which I think is fantastic. Similarly, women also put together big Cray computers. And so we see something very similar there. But eventually, it wasn't just enough to put the computers together. Women needed to learn how to code these things. So what you're looking at here is 6502, and the women learn how to code it, they take this on, and things are working away. And when I look back at my own college education, so I went to school in the late 80s, to college in the late 80s, and I don't remember being just the only woman in the room, like far from it. I remember there being loads of other women around. And in fact, if we look at this article, this one comes from the late 60s, we can see that people are, in just putting aside for the time being the notion of girls, right? But you can see like women are being driven, and this is the profession to go into. This is, teacher, programmer, nurse, like get going. So it was wonderful, and it was really taking off. And so as the importance of this job goes up, so too does the pay, because not everybody can code in assembly language, obviously. And as the pay goes up, men now start to show up. And so I'm not saying that this is, just to be clear, that this is a wrong or a bad thing. It's not like, oh, that's it, men are coming to take over jobs. It is quite literally the culture of the time. So back in the 70s, men were the traditional breadwinners. They were earning the highest paying jobs, and where those high paying jobs were, they were going to go. Also bear in mind that at this time, in some countries, if women were married, women were no longer eligible for work. So these sort of things made sense. So imagine if you've got all these men coming into jobs and they're planning to be trained by women. This wasn't going to work. People weren't being receptive to it at the time. And so out with the women and in went the men. And just to, while this seems surprising, let's take a look at some advertising from this period of time to see what the traditional things, what things were going on culturally at that point in time. We just were not ready. We were quite literally on the cusp of a female-led tech revolution, but society was not ready for it. And so let's take a look at some of those ads. So here's Brown Cookers. It's a wife saver. In some countries, as I've mentioned, you couldn't even work if you were married. Here's a shoe ad, Keep Her Where She Belongs. This is from 1974. And mind you, these appeared in completely normal magazines. I mean, nowadays, I can't even imagine if these things appeared. Here's one from Legs, 1970. It's nice to have a girl around the house. Another from Chase and Sanborn. If your husband ever finds out you're not store testing for fresher coffee, oh my God. So if you look at these, like there are loads of these advertisements, by the way. It wasn't like I cherry picked them. We were quite literally on the verge of a female-led tech revolution. And I believe that the period that we're in now is probably just an aberration. If you're interested in the non-slide version of this is a fantastic book. It's wonderfully documented, called Program Inequality. It takes you through specifically in how well, as you can see, how Britain discarded women technologists and lost its edge. It is a fantastic insight into this. So the next story is what I'll call the unicorn anomaly. When people view a coder, when if we go back to that, that stereotype, what does a programmer look like? A lot of times it doesn't look like this. In so much so that people often view women, and they'll say a female coder. And that might not even sound weird when it's said. And I myself have heard these questions, and you may have heard them too. What's it like to be a female programmer? Or in my case, what's it like to be a female game designer? What's it like to be a woman in tech? As if there's one answer to that question. Like, I can imagine that if somebody asked that question, say it was the first question asked, and I said, well, there's 40 or so women on the call, but I'll answer for all of us, assured that my answer represents everybody. And clearly, at least 39 of you would say, hold up there, Brenda, because your story is not our story. There are many, many different stories. For instance, I have heard from Amy Hennig, who is a rock star game designer. She worked on the whole Uncharted series. She's fantastic. And if you ask Amy, she'll tell you that her experience in the industry has been absolutely fine. She hasn't noticed any sexism, misogyny, nothing, nothing of note. And then I've heard some other stories that are absolutely not so pleasant and fairly horrifying. For the most part, I have had a largely great experience. I think one of the standout incidents that I've had, I remember that there was a guy, he's a game designer. This is quite obviously not to scale here. But he was so well known in our industry. And as an American, I will never get over the, ooh, somebody famous thing that we tend to have. So I remember he was talking to me. We were having this conversation about game design. And it was at a big industry event. We were both sitting up sort of on this wall, a short wall that was around this larger bar pit area. And so we were just sitting there. And at some point in time, he moves his coat over. And there's an obvious erection there. And he says to me, would you like to do something about my quite obvious erection? And as a game designer, nothing has prepared me for this moment. I have zero idea how to respond. I have spent my life behind a screen. I do not even know what to do about this entire incident. I obviously didn't do anything. I was surprised. I was offended. It was an incredibly odd situation to me. This guy's games up to the second in time had been really important to me and my own development. But now this is the most offensive, non-offensive picture in the history of pictures. But I don't know what to do. Now, I don't even know how I don't even to this day, do not remember what I said. I just remember like both of us walking back into the conference and me wanting to like push everybody to the side because, quite obviously this thing was still there, but oh my God, what a phenomenally awkward situation. And there's been other things, other questions that I'll get, like, what would I say to other women who wanted to be in tech? Or I'll get asked if I want to join a woman in games panel, or do I want to be a diversity speaker? And I want to point out there's actually nothing wrong with any of those things. Where I raise issue with them is when you have a conference that has, say, I don't know, 10 speakers during the course of the entire day, but all the women or all the people of color are like put on one single diversity panel, and the whole rest of the conference is just, is just more of the same, right? People also should have a chance to talk about their work and not just the color of the skin or their sexuality or their gender. And then there's the weird statements that need to be debunked, some of which I've already mentioned. And it ends up being that we become something other than what our work is, what we have worked for. And to me, I often refer to it as being perceived as an other. You are not the standard, and so people will ask you these questions, and it makes you feel even further apart from, because you don't feel like you belong. You feel like this other, and that you're being othered. And probably one of the best examples that I've seen of this happening is, here's Amal Clooney. So she is an international human rights lawyer. And she was, just for this picture here, she's coming out of the European Court of Human Rights, and she was there to challenge the appeal of the genocide of 1.5 million people. And as she's walking out, a reporter unbelievably asks, "Who are you wearing?" Right? Like, seriously, like, here is a woman who is quite literally trying to change the world, and he wants to know who she's wearing, as if any of us are going to, you know, care about that sort of stuff. Like, these are the questions I would like to see asked. You know, what can we do to change the world? And it happened again to her. Here she is, Time magazine. She's here, she's at the United Nations talking about ISIS here on International Women's Day, but Time magazine chooses to highlight the fact that she's pregnant. So, you know, it's her baby bump. And while I think all of these efforts are necessary, it would be fantastic if we invite these women to talk at mainstream conferences, not just about their gender, their sexuality, or their color, or their skin, unless it's actually the topic of the conference, because we are many more things than just these things. So I was actually invited by Gamma Sutra, and this is quite some time ago. It was back, I think, the late 80s even. I was invited to write an op-ed on women in games. And I said, can I take that any way I want? Can I go any angle? And they said, sure. So I decided to go with op-ed, women in games, who cares? And I asked a bunch of my friends, I did it on the phone, so they didn't have time to really react well. And I called them up and I asked these questions. Which, mind you, sound perfectly fine if you put the word female in there. So I said, what's it like to be a male game designer? And these are the actual answers I got. What? That doesn't make any sense, Brenda. What? Oh, wow. That's a pretty niche topic there, Brenda. But I doubled down as soon as they gave me that. And I asked this question: what advice do you have for men looking to break into tech? And the answers I got were even better. You're actually being serious about this. Is this a joke? So people, it sounded so weird when the shoe was on the other foot. And just as a spoiler alert, and probably a pretty obvious one, my reproductive organs, to the best of my knowledge, have never made a game or a technical decision. I have never said that I wanted to grow up and code as a woman, nor have I ever said I want to play games as a woman. And I honestly don't know that I have any gender-based goals at all. Like I never said I wanted to be a superstar at giving birth. I also, I changed the slide because I originally it said I don't know that I don't want to have the best menopause ever, but now that I'm in my early 50s, I kind of have decided that I actually do. This is actually a gender-based goal. I do want to have the best menopause I can possibly have. I think that's reasonable. So in saying all this, I'm not saying that I'm not grateful and that these things are not important. This is a picture, a somewhat blurry picture of my husband with a man dressed as a hot dog. It is the only picture that I happen to have. And I'll tell you the story of this. So my husband, John, he created a game called Quake. And they have a conference for this specific game every year. And this guy happened to be, whose name he will forever be known as Hot Dog Man to me. This guy was standing over to the side and he would walk up a little bit and then he would turn around and go away. And anyway, I just said, are you looking to meet him? And he said yes. And then he said, no. I said, are you a fan of his games? To which he replied, he was, but it wasn't that. And I said, well, let me introduce you. And he goes, no, I'm just not ready for that. And it turned out that this guy, he was in tech himself. And the reason that he got into this and the reason that he got into games was because when he was growing up, he could look and see that my husband was Mexican. And he said to me that John was his hero, not because of the games that he made, but because he made them as a Mexican, and that mattered to him. For the same reason it matters to me that the person holding down Gordon Ramsay's stars was a woman, and her name was Danny Berry. And I don't know why that matters to me, but it just does. You know, we all need role models and we need their stories to inspire us, whether that's in real life, books, tech, art. And so to me, this is why it's so critically important not to comment women out and not to ignore them, and why we have to work extra hard to include women in everything we do. So I'll give you some examples of some of the hidden and not so hidden women in tech that I absolutely love. First and foremost is Margaret Hamilton. So she's standing next to the code that she wrote that literally put men on the moon. Margaret was the director of software engineering at MIT and for the Apollo space program. And what I love about this is Margaret wrote this code while her daughter was often in the lab with her. And her daughter, in fact, found a bug. She was playing with the software behaved in a way that they weren't expecting. And so if it turned out, if the astronauts hit this instead of that, it was going to cause something wrong to happen. Margaret said, I know this isn't the design. However, if we do this instead of that, it will cause something wrong to happen. And they said, astronauts would not make those mistakes. Well, as it turned out, astronauts do make those mistakes. And you can watch the movie about that very problem. Here's another person, Lois Mitchell. So Lois Mitchell was instrumental in Fortran. And sometimes, and maybe this is just because I'm in the gaming space, I will sometimes get questions, yeah, but did women write, did they write anything hardcore? Well, how about the optimizing compiler? Frances Allen wrote that. And the very first assembly language was actually created by Kathleen Booth. And I should say before I switch off Frances Allen, for writing the optimizing compiler, she actually won the Turing Award. So Kathleen Booth writes the first assembly, and then there's Melba Roy, who was NASA's first computer. And she tracked Echo satellites and went on to become the program production section chief in the Goddard Space Center. This is a slide that I swear if there wasn't a picture of it, nobody would believe it. Sister Mary Kenneth Keller, one of my personal favorites, was instrumental in the creation of BASIC. So for those of you coding, BASIC is always one of the first languages that programmers start with, me included. And then this was Kay McNulty. She was Irish speaking and originally from Donegal. So Kay was the lead programmer of an all-female coding team on the very first computer called the ENIAC. What is fascinating about this is that when these women were working on this computer, and again, going back to the menial, detail-oriented nature of it, they were actually left out of the 50th anniversary of the ENIAC until someone found out about that and made sure that those who still survived were invited. The very first computer science course that was ever offered in a college was founded by a husband and wife team, and the very first computer science, of which Alexandra Forsythe is part of that husband. Her husband was George. She writes the very first computer science textbook. And this is where, from this school and from this very program, is where the founders of Google, YouTube, Netflix, Mozilla, Instagram, and many, many others go through this actual course. And she was actually going to Brown University at the time. She was she was pursuing her PhD in mathematics, and she lost her funding. She lost her funding not because she did something ridiculous or was a bad student. She lost her funding because she was a woman. And her program, the dean of the school did not believe that women should be learning mathematics. I'm not sure particularly why that's dangerous, but I love math and I feel dangerous now because of it. So Donna Bailey also created Centipede. And then if you like adventure games, that was Roberta Williams who was behind that. And even some of the oldest digital games that we know of, the Sumerian game, for instance, were invented by a woman. And this is 1962, which is incredibly early. And even everything from Jenga to Monopoly was also created by a woman. And the key thing is we have always been here. Computer science was quite literally founded by women. And percentage-wise, there had to have been many of us. It's not like that they cherry-picked these women to say, look, we need to have a diverse founding group. There were many of us at the time. And in fact, when I went to college, 37% of the cohort were actually women. And loads of women were heading into computer science. And if we look at things today, we can see that there are millions of women in technology. We are half the population, and in fact, the majority of the Silicon Valley workforce, but yet less than a third of tech workers are women. And of those tech workers, only a fifth of us are in leadership positions. And what that ends up meaning is that there's a load of tech decisions that are not taking into account our experience, and the results of this affect our health and our well-being, and to a lesser extent, our enjoyment or maybe even our success. Very close to home, I would like to introduce you to what I refer to as the man hands controller. So the very first Xbox that came out, this controller was called Fatty, or the Duke, in all territories except Japan. It was, I wish I had one anywhere. I do have one in the office, but it was massive. So here is it in a normal person's hands. And this is how it felt in mine. It was so incredibly large. Game Informer gave it the blunder of the year. And eventually they released the Japanese controller worldwide. And it's true, obviously, that hand sizes do matter. And this comes into tech not just with the controllers, but also with phone sizes. We are progressively pushing to bigger and bigger screens, from roughly 4.5 inches to 6.2 inches with the latest. And the phone that fits best into the average woman's hands has now been discontinued by Apple. And while it looks great in this picture, the reality is that women, because of the size of it, end up dropping their phone more often, especially in situations which are, I need my phone quickly. This is actually the phone that fits best into women's hands. And it's not gone without notice, that people are talking about. It can affect women's safety as well. And what's considered standard size should account for all their customers. In something that I thought was pretty great, Apple actually introduced cycle tracking last year in 2019. So I thought that was good, and it does exactly what you would think it would do. It lets you know if your period's coming up and what your fertility window is. This is a massive, big business, by the way, if you're not familiar with it. Now, here's what's interesting. We're talking about this being 2019. 5 years prior to that is when Apple comes out with HealthKit. It took them 5 years to introduce what is the single biggest thing that happens to over 2 billion women who happen to be in this age group. And it took 5 years to introduce that. Even Disney talked about it in 1946, right? So it is, and this is a bit from a Disney movie. It also, interestingly enough, things you never thought you were going to hear today. This Disney film in 1946 was also the first use of the word vagina in a film. And so another thing that they have, you'll be leaving this today with tons of trivia for pub quizzes. Another thing that was fascinating is it actually got into our AI. So if you're familiar with this, Amazon actually had a recruitment engine that they created. You can imagine they get a zillion resumes. And they're known for their automation, so it made sense to automate this process. So what they did is they trained their AI over the emails that they had received over the last 10 years. And with that, here's all the emails we received. Here's the ones that we happened to hire. And what ended up happening was that most of those resumes were from men, and most of the hires were from men, which makes sense if you look at who is going into computer science, particularly at that time. But what happened is if you went to a women's college, or you had things like women's chess club in your resume, those were devalued. And so the end result was that it actually, instead of being AI neutral, it actually crept into the AI, oh, this is a men's college, let's mark this up. So it ended up that Amazon just retired that entire program entirely. GitHub, in 2017, a group of academics decided to take a look at GitHub. And they found that women's contributions were rated higher and accepted more often than men. However, if their gender was known, that rate dropped by 20%. And Facebook, up until 2018, actually allowed employers to target recruitment ads. So you could place an ad and leave out, you could just look for men, so you could totally leave out women and non-binary people entirely. In 2018, the ACLU sued, and that is no longer the practice. That's gone. And you would think things like this would be obvious, but sometimes they just aren't. And the point I'm getting at here is that when we look at the whole scheme of things, it's endemic, it's scary, it's disheartening, it's wrong, it's bullshit. But the great thing about it is it's also engineered, and it hasn't always been here. And that means that it can be changed. So as women have gradually left computing and even been pushed out in the 70s, the thing people believe is, well, I guess women just aren't interested in code, except that's quite obviously not true. So it was a temporary aberration that was engineered. And I'm I'm positive we can reach parity. So how would I think we would do that? Well, the first is we need to clear away myths. I hear this all the time, that girls aren't good at maths and IT. But the reality is, in study after study after study shows us that girls are actually good at maths and IT. And in fact, this is true regardless of your gender. If you're told you're not good at something by a person who is in a position of authority, you will often live down to that. That is the risk, that is the potential. And so if people are regularly told that, they can start actually believing it. A great thing that Science Foundation Ireland found out is the single most important influencer into a child's life, regardless of their gender, is their mother. And if mothers say you are absolutely great at something, then kids will start to believe it. And so it can be more important than anything else. And I believe it must change. It must change just because it's right, but also because it's the business case. Women were the original computers. We created code. We created programming languages. We built the machines. We put a man on the moon. And just to be petty, we also built the man that we put on the moon. And as much as I'm saying this, it's not about diversity. It is about diversity, not exclusion. And I think sometimes, depending on how it's presented, it can sound like women are saying, all right, I see there's 20 men here and 1 woman. We need to have 10 men and 10 women. So I need 9 of you men to get the hell out of the room. But it's not about that. It's about adding chairs. It's about getting to equal, because diverse teams are better in work and education. And there's a load of research on that. It's about getting rid of the barriers. And it's also the business case. Right now, if we say that this is what you're looking at, that's what we're trying to hire toward, that's great. But our industry is growing. And we need skilled bodies to fill those chairs. And if companies don't address what's keeping these chairs empty, they risk falling behind due to lack of skilled talent. I also think we could do some work in changing the marketing. So I was getting back into, as you can see here, I was getting back into C last year. And so I decided to just take a refresher course, and the tutorial on it, the #1 highest recommended tutorial, was this guy. And I imagined trying to convince my 19-year-old daughter that this is something that she should take, right? So here's this, like, I'm old, I'm white, and I'm a man. Like, and it's just, there's better ways to sell it. Like, I think about, what if Margaret Hamilton were there instead? Right? Like, here's, and she's got, exceptional pedigree. And then I'm about to show you a series of images that are from an actual advertising campaign by a company in the game industry from 2001. So they were looking for programmers, and what they offered, first of all, they offered you a custom-made tuxedo. Now, I do not have one. I've never thought of having one, but if I did have one, I think I could rock it. The next thing that they offered was Sex Panther cologne. Again, I've never wanted Sex Panther cologne, but maybe that I didn't feel specifically pushed aside, but it was the beard grooming oil. I love a good beard, but I do not want a good beard. And this absolutely did not speak to my gender. And as you can also see, they gave away $10,000 wrapped in bacon as well. I'd take the 10 grand. As a vegetarian, I'm not so interested in the bacon, but definitely not interested in the beard oil. But these messages say you are not welcome. And I think it's critical that we change that message. I sometimes think about doing something like summer camp for exceptional coders and saying repeatedly that girls are natural coders and IT is for girls, and saying it until they've heard it up to their ears, not just for that reason, but because it also happens to be true. I remember when I was a kid, I was told, I've already mentioned we didn't have much money, and I remember being told that I wouldn't amount to anything by a teacher, and that I would live in the worst part of town, and I was told I had no chance of getting into the college I wanted to go to. And I was also suggested that I shouldn't make the games that I was making, and those games were part of the reason I ended up winning a BAFTA. And the good news is I'm not one of those kids. If you tell me I can't do something, that is probably going to immediately go to the top of my list. And so sure, I'm a fighter, and I wrote 3 books, and I made those games, and I got into the college, and I eventually didn't live in Elaine. I live in Galway, and it's a long way from where I thought I would end up, or people thought I would. But I'm not always a fighter. And sometimes I can believe the things I hear. And I think about like what, sorry, it always chokes me up when I think about that. Like, what if there's this kid, because, you know, code can be the great equalizer. And what if there's this kid who comes from a poor family like I did and falls in love with computing like I did and is told that there's not a place for her? Like that could have literally transformed her life, and how sad that would be if that happens. You know, I think about how many people we've lost to those messages. You know, tech and education is for everyone. And I want anyone who wants into this industry to be able to come in and feel like they're welcome, whether they're school kids or entry level or graduates, or even people teaching people how to do this thing, that someday, you know, we create a culture where images like this, you know, we just go, oh yeah, you know, it's women in tech. It's just some girls learning how to code. And it looks like a normal thing and not an afterthought. And with that, that is it. That is my talk. Thank you. And now I will stop sharing if I can figure out how to do so. There we are.
Thank you,
Stop
Brenda.
sharing.
There's loads of comments coming through in the chat about how brilliant your presentation is, and how well argued, and what a significant contribution it is making to encouraging us all to think about changing the world. So a few people have put some questions into the chat, and I'm going to start working through them now, and a few people have had their hands up as well, so we'll see how far we get. So I had a question myself, and my colleague Síochán Sun also is raising a similar point, which is really, what can we do now to change all of this together?
What can we do to change all of this together? Well, you know, I think one of the best things is that if you are a parent, and if you are a parent, you are in an incredibly powerful position to change that message. To talk about code in terms of gender neutral, you know, that it's not something boys are great at or something girls are great at. I also know loads and loads of men who have been steered away from nursing. You know, even though that's what they wanted to do because that was a woman's job. So I think that's one thing that we can do. If you are in a position where you can hire people, when we are looking to hire people, I cast a really wide net. And I will ask people, please share this in your own individual communities, hoping that I can reach more people than I might normally be able to reach on my own. We also, when we are reviewing applicants, we do a blind review. So we don't know whose code we're looking at. We don't know whose art we're looking at, whose design test we're looking at. We will hire the best candidate, but it helps if we don't know who that person is, in that we can't be affected by that. Now, let's hope I'm not hiring anybody who would say, oh, it's a woman, I don't want her great code, bring in all the guys. But, you know, I think we are in a unique position to change things. You know, I hope that we get to a point as a company, like I will take any opportunity to speak to young women about learning code and how that can be exciting. There's a fantastic organization called I Wish, which is here in the Republic. They do a show in Dublin, Cork. I think they're going to do one in Limerick. And there are 1,400 young transition year women that go through that. And while they might hear like, are you interested in biomedical engineering? Maybe. But if I just go out there and I say, how many of you could make a better Snapchat? Or how many of you think you could make the next TikTok? And their hands are all up. Well, how are you going to do that with code? And suddenly it gets them thinking about the problem from their perspective. I think it's just, there's so many different ways that we can reinforce this. Whether it's learning about our own histories and feeling pride in our own histories, whether it's introducing people who might not have an opportunity to code or hear about that, and sharing that information with them. And this talk is recorded, obviously, so it can be shared in other places as well. And I would say that, you know, if you are in a position to share it, please do. But it's, I guess for me, it's just, I've decided that, especially after I got that women are not interested in tech, it's like that, I'm going to speak every single opportunity that I possibly can about just how not interested in tech I am. And I guess it's just taking whatever opportunity to say something and stand up for what the right thing is.
Thank you. It is really important, I think, as parents of daughters. There's loads of people putting stuff in the chat about how important it is to encourage our daughters not to become gendered, even outside of the influences that we have on them. And I think even as a parent of a young daughter, I can see sometimes how outside influences have, can creep in and bring in some negative messaging. The other question that has been raised is, how important is it for people starting in tech to have good role models and strong networks?
Well, how important, I mean, if you're just starting in tech, I think what good role models can do, I guess they're a good, strong role model, and I wouldn't have just one either. They can sort of show you an outline, like a book. How did the book get from A to Z, and how might you also do the same? That sort of stuff is fascinating to me. For me, my role models, because I got into the game industry so early, my role models were men. And one of them actually has ended up being a bit more of a rock star to me than he even was when I was first getting into games. It's a guy named Nasser Jabeli, and he left Iran in 1979, which was when there was the uprising and all kinds of crazy stuff. And Nasser Jabeli goes on to be the sole coder of Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. But I find, and even when I see, and I don't know why, I guess it's somebody who has experience that you draw strength from, whether or not you want to even do that thing yourself. So for instance, Jess Murphy, she owns a Kai restaurant here in Galway, and she's often lauded as, one of the best chefs in Ireland. And man, she's a firebrand. She's just a rock star. And I will never learn to cook. I don't care about cooking. My husband is an excellent chef, but I love that she's just a badass. And I would like to be that same kind of badass. So role models, I think, if you draw strength from them, that's always useful. Now there was a second half of the question, which I've completely spaced on.
So it was just about building networks.
Oh, building networks. Oh man, network? How it's incredibly valuable to build your network. I mean, because that's where you hear about gigs. Or if you're, thinking about going to this company and you want to find out what the real story is at that company, that's where you can also find that sort of stuff out. Networks, especially in tech, are really, really important. I find, especially among women in tech, and women in games, there's not a ton of us. So those networks are very well formed and tight. And there are even, like, there's recently a women in games. This was last Friday. There was a Women in Games award show, and that whole organization there's actually men helping to run that organization. So it's not it's not exclusive if you're not a woman. It's just people who are interested in diversity, and that's a fantastic network as well. But yeah, I mean, I guess the closer you, at some point in time, the longer that you've been in the industry or the longer you've been in tech, it's useful also to give that back. And it's not really a one-way street. I find that even though I've been in the industry now going on 40 years, that when I work with somebody who's just getting into the industry, they're letting me know what, I have the benefit of, 30 years of dinosaur history, which can, hold me back if I value it too much. But somebody who's just getting into the industry can be like, this is actually the hot thing you need to pay attention to. And that's an incredibly valuable thing.
Faye had raised a question linked to this, which is really, how do you balance the time it takes to be creative and develop new things with being a role model and guiding leadership and networks?
It's the awkward part in that question is the role model bit. That is not something certainly that I see. I don't think anybody rolls out of bed in the morning and goes, all right, today's my day. I'm going to be Role Model Tuesday. Like I would never think of it like that. I mean, the bio that was read at the beginning, I wrote as part of we'll say my academic journey. And there was a time in 1989 that the only thing that it would have said was, has succeeded in getting a degree. And then at some point in time, it would have said, was lucky enough to work on a team of people who got Game of the Year. And then was lucky enough to work on a design team whose lead designer got Game of the Year. But eventually, if you fail to die and you don't change your industry, those sort of things pile up. And just keep doing what you're doing. How I balance things, and I think this is more important now more than ever, because it used to be I would leave the office and I would come home to a separate home space, whereas now my home space is my office space. I balance it by, I actually fully get away from the machine. And I read and I go places with my kids, and I try to work actually 40 hours a week, 40 normal hours a week. And I would also say, like, in terms of, being an advocate, I probably speak about once a week. It's easier now than it was. I've also done other things, like I'll record, this is quite obviously not a recorded talk, but I'll record, say, this talk, I'll do a version of a talk, I will record it, and anybody who says, hey, we're interested in having you speak, and I'll say, well, I can't be there right now, but you can have this talk. And so I guess I found ways to streamline that. Probably the largest pressure I would feel just from being a visible person talking about these things are sometimes the garbage that comes along with that on social media, which is never fun. But that said, a friend of mine who's a game designer said reading the comments on YouTube or Twitter or on any form of social media is like opening a garbage can and breathing deep. So, I try to read comments as little as possible and just do what I do.
Thank you. We're at the very end of the time of today's session. So Brenda, I'm just going to take the time to thank you for delivering such a brilliant and inspirational talk, and for relaunching our Future Tuesdays series for the year. I think we've all been very privileged to be in the room and hear what you said. And certainly Paul, the director of Future Screens, had to leave early, and one of the things that he said in the chat is that he hopes Future Screens can play a role in addressing some of the challenges that you've outlined. So thank you very much for your time. It's been brilliant.
Thanks, Brenda. That was amazing.
Thank you. And if anybody has any questions and didn't get to ask them, feel free to ping me on Twitter. Just my handle is just my initials, @BR.
Thanks, Brenda. That was great.
Thank you. I will see you all at some point, hopefully in a live event somewhere, some point.
Thanks so much, Brenda.
All right, bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks a million. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you.